Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, as always, we'd like to thank our executive producers, Tom McCool, Tony Turrin, Justus Ebel, and Jeremy Marcoux. If you'd like to help support the show, you can check us out at patreon.com/historiesmost or send us an email at histories.most@gmail.com for any comments, feedback, or suggestions. Thanks so much, and now, on with the episode. When dealing with a period of time that has almost nothing written about it contemporaneously, how do we know what's actually real? What's fact or fiction? What's true or false? And who is real and who is imagined? That's one of the problems when dealing with an era that has so little verifiable information about it. With time, things become distorted. Figures who may or may not have existed become inextricably linked with a period, regardless of their historicity. That's part of what we're going to be discussing today. A legendary figure from the 5th century, King Arthur. Someone who essentially cannot be separated from discussion about it, because he is the most famous figure from the 5th century, despite whether he actually existed or not. This mystery and more continue in history's most puzzling century. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and we are continuing today to explore what we've termed history's most puzzling century, the 5th century AD, in particular in Britain. It's my pleasure to say that today we are joined by Professor Nick Higham, author of, among other things, King Arthur, The Making of the Legend. Thank you for joining us, Nick.
You're welcome.
Well, first thing I want to ask, before we get into Arthur proper, so to speak, we have talked to a few people so far, Susan West-Susan, Max Adams, about the 5th century. And really, I think one of the great things about this series has been the contrasting opinions and theories about what was actually happening and what we can confidently say was happening in 5th century Britain. So that's really where I want to start with you, Nick, is what do you think we can confidently say about the 5th century in Britain?
The simple answer to that is very little. We know that the Roman Empire was in deep trouble across the 5th century, and in the West it was effectively disintegrating. Roman direct rule of Britain ended around 410. You can use that date, but in fact it's probably wrong. And the Western Empire was no longer capable of interfering in British affairs, in restoring Roman rule, for example. It was in retreat across the next few decades, right the way across Gaul and in Spain. And by 500, all you've got really is the control of southern Gaul, Provence, if you like, and Italy, which is in fact passed to Gothic rulers who are operating very much hand in glove with major Roman aristocrats representing mostly North Italy, but also South Gaul and to a limited extent places like Sicily. So all that leaves Britain very much out on the edge. But we know that Britain remained in contact, particularly through ecclesiastical linkages with Gaul particularly. And we have people like St. Germanus, the Bishop of Auxerre, turning up in Britain at the end of the 420s, apparently having been invited to come and and face down an outbreak of heresy, which was linked with a supposed Briton. He's also sometimes called a Scot, Pelagius, who was in Rome around 410, left it to avoid the sack of Rome, and moved eastwards, not back to Britain, but some of his followers appear to have been in Britain in the 420s. And it's very much a sign that Britain was still very Roman in that respect, that you've got them saying to Gaulish clergy, please come and give us a hand here. We've got a theological issue that we don't really have a handle on. Come and give us a hand. And we have other connections too. We have a British cleric who went over to become the abbot of Les Reins near Marseille, and ended up as a bishop in Gaul in the second half of the century. So you can sort of feel that Britain is still quite Roman. And if you look at the religious issues, I think you find that there is a strong shift towards being more Roman in the 5th century. If you look at the archaeology around 400, you find there's quite a lot of pagan temples and pagan-looking burial grounds still in use. This all seems to end during the 5th century, and you've got a strong commitment to Christianity, and that includes a missionary effort in Ireland, and apparently also in lands north of Hadrian's Wall. So you could see the Britons really sort of taking on the imperial cult and saying, look, here we are very Roman, leading through to people like Patrick. We don't know when Patrick is. He could be a 4th, 5th century person. He's more generally thought of as a 5th century person, but he's working in Latin. He's taking the Bible to Ireland. And then you move on to Gildas, who is probably writing in the 6th century, but he has clearly had a Roman style, a late Roman style education. He clearly is a Roman speaker. He has rhetoric. He has grammar. He knows his way around Roman culture. And a lot of the things that he actually alludes to makes Britain still sound very Roman. It's still a place that has governance and so on when he is writing, which appears to be the 6th century. So, you can talk about Britain becoming ever more Celtic. There is certainly a collapse of Roman material culture going on in the first half of the 5th century. But there is a strong sort of intellectual tradition still. And, Gildas really demonstrates this. We haven't got much else. But there are people there. He and his audience clearly are thinking themselves very much as Latinists and as Christians, and they have libraries. Gildas has 2 Bibles, for example, and he has a copy of Erosius. So, these are people who are still maintaining a very strong Roman tradition, even though the governance of Britain has fallen away from Rome and has gone its own path. So, it's rather a difficult area. If we knew more about the 5th century, we wouldn't have King Arthur.
Quite, yeah. And I think it is, the more we've kind of talked to people, the more I think it's the way the historiography is going, isn't it? That really it's more, I don't want to say continuity rather than change, because I think there obviously is change in the 5th century, but it's more evolution rather than collapse, if you see what I mean, the kind of traditional narrative. One thing that one of our previous guests, Max Adams, talked about It's something that is really tricky with the 5th century to try and reconstruct a kind of polito-military history. And maybe it's foolish to even try. One thing he suggested was that perhaps with what you say, what we've mentioned just now about Gildas, clearly someone who feels quite strongly about Rome, or at least Roman Christianity, is it useful then to think about almost a Roman versus non-Roman, or Christian versus pagan split in 5th century Britain? Do you think there's a kind of a dichotomy there, or not?
Well, I think really that the paganism has died away. There is virtually no evidence of paganism moving into the second half of the 5th century, whereas you do have lots of evidence of monasticism beginning. You have Gildas referring to clergy in numbers, and there are bishops, and to have an interest in what is and what is not heresy is a long way down the line from having an interest in whether somebody is pagan or Christian. It's at a different level. The whole Roman issue, I think, is a different matter. I mean, Gildas doesn't see himself as Roman. He sees himself, if he sees himself as anything, as British. Although that, I have to say, is debated. But a man like Gildas is looking to the past and seeing the Roman as somewhat separate and as an external conqueror of Britain with God's blessing. And he sees the Britons as if the Israelites of the Old Testament. So it's a new vision of a provincial people, but one deeply embedded in the Bible, which is, of course, from a British perspective, a thoroughly Roman book. It's coming from the empire.
And do you think there's anything at all, before we get into the the legendary, I suppose, figures of this period, can we, with any confidence, say anything at all about people like, say, Vortigern or Ambrosius Aurelianus, or really are they kind of just names that we can't really do much else with?
Well, Vortigern is a Celtic name. A long time ago, it was suggested that it is a name that is reflected in Gildas's term "proud tyrant." Whether or not that's the case is not provable, but it's clearly a possibility, which suggests that Gildas has the same person in mind. The name only comes through once we get to Bede, who appears to have alternative sources of information. But of course, that source of information may simply be an interpolation to his text of Gildas. We don't know. Ambrosius, all we know is what Gildas tells us. And Gildas actually says something quite interesting about Ambrosius, that he is, in inverted commas, the last of the Romans. And coming from Gildas, who says very little about people generally, I mean, he names very few people, that's probably quite telling. And I would say that it probably means that he is aware that Ambrosius is not in origin British, that he is actually somebody from a continental family who has settled on estates in Britain and has sort of, become a member of the British community, but he is recognizably continental in origin, and his family is, which makes him an interesting figure, which perhaps relates back to people like Germanus, who are coming in from the continent, and even to Constantine III, who is a character who Gildas skates over, but is well known in Orosius and so on, other writers. If you look at Constantine III, although he is leading rebellion initially in Britain, there is the hint, at least, that his son, who is a monk, was actually a monk in Gaul. He only enters the story after Constantine has crossed the Channel. And Constantine crosses the Channel very, very quickly indeed, and takes no further interest in Britain whatsoever, as far as one can tell. My guess is that Constantine III is actually a continental, not a Briton. The only information that we have about the ethnicity of those individuals relates to another one who it is said was British. To my mind, the implication is that the others were both continentals.
And in a way that kind of fits the pattern of rebellions in Britain going back to the 4th century, even Constantine the Great, the first.
Well, and the 3rd century, Carausius, Electus, Magnus Maximus is Spanish in origin. As you say, Constantine, yes.
So there seems to be a kind of pattern in Britain of kind of military commanders rising up, doesn't there?
Yeah, and all senior military commanders in Britain before 400 are not British.
Yeah, kind of classic Roman technique of deploying troops where they're not native. Interesting, though, I hadn't heard that before, the idea that Ambrosius was not natively British, but it kind of, I see where you're coming from.
It's what Gildas tells us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think Gildas is likely to know, because Gildas, he seems to know, if not know personally, at least know quite a bit about his grandsons. At the time of writing, he actually says his grandsons have gone downhill from their grandfather's excellence, sort of thing. So he knows people around at the moment who knew Ambrosius.
So if we can, we can't say that much about the 5th century, but I think in a way we're kind of building up this picture of some form of evolution of the Roman state into some sort of localized British variant, whatever it may be, which goes hand in hand as well with what is a bit anachronistic to call Roman Catholic Church, but I think our listeners will kind of get what we mean, the church centered in Rome, to kind of the political and religious elements go hand in hand by the late Roman Empire, and that obviously presages what comes in the medieval period. We've talked quite a bit there about the primary sources as well that we have for the period, like Patrick and Gildas. And I think now it's time to kind of explore the legend then. The one aspect of what we might call the Dark Ages, in inverted commas, that the one figure that people may know is, of course, King Arthur. Well, figure, we'll see. But straight away, I think we've talked about those primary sources, Gildas and Patrick. They don't mention an Arthur. They don't even hint at one. Although, of course, Gildas's Battle of Baden Hill has been, tied ever since into the Arthur legend. Does that mean anything at all? Is it significant, do you think, that there is no mention in those earliest primary sources?
Well, to my mind, as a historian, that means you cannot have a King Arthur as a historical figure, because without contemporary or near contemporary evidence, or evidence that you can relate back to contemporary or near contemporary evidence, you have no evidence. It is equivalent to claiming that Gandalf is historical in Lord of the Rings. Gandalf, the name, turns up in the Middle Ages. There is a Gandalf, Bishop of Rochester, in the Norman Conquest period. That's where Tolkien got the name, I suspect. I don't know, I didn't ask him. But just because you have a name of a leading figure who was quasi-religious, well, he was religious, but Gandalf is a quasi-religious figure, and there are certain similarities. They both wear the same sort of garb, but not hats. They are not the same person. And you therefore have to take into account the idea that a later writer will fictionalize the past for his own purposes, just as Tolkien did. He was obviously writing fiction, but when it comes to the history of the Britons in the 9th century, people, because they take the word history in the title, they like to think that the purpose for which it was written was historical. And by any conception of what we think of as historical, it was not.
Well, that was a decisive answer, I think.
Well, I have to say it in a very decisive way, because otherwise you end up saying, well, could you possibly have an Arthur? Well, no, you can't. It's like saying that Captain America is a historical figure in the 20th century. He represents things. He's an interesting construct, but he is not a historical figure. Fact. You can't get round it. There is a difference between fiction and history, which we need to police.
Then I want to look at then. First of all, I think there's been a change in the historiography from, what happened in the 5th century, for example, over the last 30 years or so, particularly in the archaeology. I think more and more people saying actually there's more continuity, there's more evolution rather than a dramatic collapse, town abandonment, etc. Similarly, I think there's been on a roughly similar timescale, you look at the 1970s, for example, people like Leslie Alcock, John Morris, respected scholars, not popular authors, were writing fairly confidently about a historical Arthur. They couldn't say much about him at all, but they were kind of fairly confident that they could say he existed. But equally, probably over the 20, 30 years afterwards, it's kind of turned on its head again, I think, and very much now historians would not subscribe to that view, as you've kind of set out for us today, Nick. So why do you think that, let's say in the 1970s, scholars of the period were tempted to say that there was a historical author, and what's happened in between time?
Well, I think a major issue which people tend to ignore is the Second World War. The fact of the matter is that both Leslie Alcock and John Morris were in the armed forces, and they were, I think, affected by this ideological battle between good and evil, Britain versus Germany. And you can take that back into the past and fight it out again in the Dark Ages with King Arthur as the central heroic figure. But in fact, it's a longer running issue than that. On the whole, in this country, King Arthur had become no more than a minor footnote in history by the end of the Victorian period. There are exceptions, but on the whole, that's how it works. However, the leading Celticist of the day, who was a German scholar, very good German scholar, at the end of the 19th century, re-examined the history of the Britons and came up with the view that many of its passages were based upon much earlier writings, and therefore can be allowed a degree of authority. And one of the ones that he said was early was the chapter 56, the Arthur story. And this led to Arthur being reintroduced to British history over a longer time span. The key figure in this is not really John Morris or Leslie Alcock, it's R.G. Collingwood, who was the great Romanist, looking at Roman Britain and its inscriptions, particularly between the wars. Now, again, he was someone who was deeply affected by the conflict with Germany, in his case, the First World War. It is often said that of his peer group graduating with him, he was the only person not to die in the First World War of his particular group of people. And he became the professor at Oxford, extremely senior figure, and wrote the definitive early work on Roman Britain. And he reintroduced King Arthur as a credible figure of the 5th century. And people like John Morris and Leslie Alcock were educated at university using that book. And there was virtually no other. I'm not as old as John Morris, who I incidentally did meet, or Leslie Alcock, who I also met. But even when I was at university in the 1970s, which seems an awful long time ago, R.G. Collingwood's book was still the major starting point for reading Roman Britain. So you can see the way that his influence has come all the way through from the 1930s. And it's been picked up in different ways by different people. So you have this sort of upsurge in the 1970s, which is really fueled by the excavation of South Cadbury Hill Fort, which was a huge national event. It was broadcast on the BBC. It had a committee running its design, chaired by Mortimer Wheeler. You know, it was a major phenomenon of the early post-conflict period, in which, you know, the archaeological establishment got behind this, and it discovered a fortress, an Iron Age hill fort that had been refortified in the late 5th century. Well, there you go. It's Arthur. It has to be Arthur. And Leslie Alcock convinced himself the first time round that he had discovered King Arthur. When he came to reply to his critics later on, he actually retrenched and said, we found a late 5th century refortification of a hill fort. Because short of, you know, Arthur was here as an inscription stuck in the middle of it, you can't prove anything about Arthur at all.
I think that's really fascinating. I hadn't heard, before of this kind of idea of, in particular, the way the world wars might have influenced. But of course, you know, that is history writing, isn't it? People write history for and of the time they're writing in.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's peculiar that, in fact, it's a German scholar, Zimmer, who actually starts the ball rolling. But that's in the pre-First World War period, when English and German scholarship were working very much hand in glove. And on the whole, the German was the hand and the British were the glove. The German scholarship of the late 19th century was extremely good in comparison with English that wasn't particularly. So, you can see why they went down that road, because they were led there by the best man at the time, writing in German.
Yeah, and it always tends to be the way that if one authority on a particular subject picks up an idea, then it'll just be taken as read for a generation.
That's right. And R.G. Collingwood then did that inside British archaeology. He was the man of his generation and for a very long time to come.
So if we have these late 19th, early 20th century historians, archaeologists, basically they take Arthur, as read as a historical figure, yes, fine, and that influences historians for many years to come. Let's kind of rewind a bit and let's go right back to the earliest kind of mentions. And we did mention, I think you have mentioned the Historia Britonum, the history of the Britons. Is that Nennius, isn't it? I think.
If you like, yeah, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. Credited to Nennius.
It's anonymous, really, but yeah. That's in the early 9th century.
So he's writing, or whoever it is, is writing or compiling, about 300 years afterwards, or nearly 400 years later, after supposedly Arthur was existing. And so I guess what we're doing really is tracing the history of a legend here. Is that the earliest kind of origin of this legend, or was it picking up on an earlier tradition?
That's a very difficult question. I would say that the legend itself is constructed in the early 9th century. However, there are one or two things that he was using in constructing it. There is the name Arthur in use in the Irish Sea region. There was a prince of the Scots up in Argyll who had the name around 600, which is a bit peculiar because it's a Gaelic-speaking court and it's a Welsh name by that date, or if you like, it's a Latin name. But the king was probably married to a British wife. Therefore, you can imagine the use of British names as well as Gaelic names. And there are, in fact, a scatter of British names within that dynasty in the next 2 generations. So it sort of makes sense. And it occurs in 1 or 2 other places. There's a king of Southwest Wales who has the name, we're not quite sure when, but sometime around the 6th century, probably, it's that sort of time. So the name is around. And it also occurs in the form that we have it in the history of the Britons, in that very difficult early Old Welsh collection of poems. You can call it a poem if you like. It's really a collection of elegies called the Godolphin, which appears to have been, well, it deals with a subject matter, which is basically 6th century. It may or may not have been written in the 6th century, in the late 6th century, somewhere around Edinburgh, which is the land of the Godolphin. And it refers in passing, very much in passing, to somebody being not so successful as a warrior as Arthur. But it is such a slight allusion, and it tells us nothing about Arthur, that it's very difficult to know what to do with it. But it's possible that the history of the Britons, which dates to a time when a new king has taken over Gwynedd in northwest Wales, and he's writing for this guy called Murphin, who appears to have come from the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man is a good mixing place for Gaelic and British, and Northumbrian for that matter, and may well have brought the name and the story of the Godolphin with him. we certainly know that the Godolphin arrived in Wales at some point in the 8th, 9th century, because that's where it survived. It didn't survive in the north.
So you've got the name knocking about. Some people called that, which we could, may or may not be anything to do with the legend that emerges in the 9th century.
Yeah.
So in the 9th century, the history of the Britons is written as it's court piece in Wales. What does it actually say? It seems to be, is this the famous story of the 12 battles? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Finishing with Baden.
So he basically is this sort of itinerant warrior who's going everywhere across England, more or less, fighting the Saxons.
Well, no, he isn't. No, you've got to step back and say he's being constructed as a fictional character to fill in the blanks in Gildas. You see, Gildas refers to a war that was fought between the Britons and the Saxons, the initial leader of which was Ambrosius Aurelianus, which ended in the year of Baden, the siege of Baden Hill. Now, what the author of the Historia Britonum does is construct that warfare. And he does it as 12 victories, 12, of course, good biblical number. And he ends it with Baden, which is a super victory in which Arthur personally, on his own, charged and killed more Saxons than you could even imagine. So he claims the whole story of the war for his hero figure, and he says that the war is 100% successful. Battle after battle, 12 battles, leading up to the final success of the Britons. But after that, the Saxons cheated, because what they did was they got loads more of their mates and the kings from the continent, meaning that that's why we lost England and why we only got Wales. It wasn't our fault. It wasn't Arthur's fault. We won all the battles. They cheated. It's a story that you have to put into the broader context, not of what happened, but what the author of the Historia Britonum is trying to achieve. You've got to see the logic of the text rather than simply say, oh, well, is Arthur real or is he not? No, of course he's not. If you go back to the Historia Britonum and read the whole of it, you realize that what the author is doing is constructing a history for the purpose of showing that the Britons are a successful warrior people and that they have been conquered in the past, but they have resisted and have had success. So what you get in the Historia Britonum is the story of the conquest by Rome, and you'll find a very strong resistance to Rome, it's resistance to Julius Caesar actually, led by a figure who is completely unhistorical and actually has a Latin name, who you can identify as an aristocrat of the period, but in Rome, who's been borrowed to become the great commander of the Britons to fight off the Romans. They don't succeed. The Roman conquest occurs, but the Britons keep on resisting. They hardly manage to tax Britain. And eventually the Romans are chased out of Britain by the Britons. You then move forward to the same problem with the Saxons. And what the book is about is saying to the British people, and particularly the king, don't give up hope. You may be struggling at the moment against this huge English empire, but the time will come, and it's imminent, when we will drive them back to the sea, and they will never be brave enough to come back to Britain. Britain is the land of the Britons, and the Britons are worthy people to have that land. And you see, Arthur is fitting into that context. Arthur belongs there. He is the next figure along after that resistance to the Romans. He is the great figure of resistance against the Saxons. Everybody knows in the 9th century that he failed. So you accommodate that by saying, well, the Saxons, they cheated, they got loads more Saxons. They overwhelmed us by numbers, not fair, but our time will still come. And in a sense, that takes you all the way back to Gildas. Because Gildas's history is not for the purpose of history. It is for the purpose of demonstrating a particular relationship between God and his people. And it's the same relationship as you have between God and the Old Testament people of Israel. When his people are obedient to him, God protects his people. When his people are disobedient to him, then God will chastise his people. And one of his ways of doing that, when he's not throwing loads of frogs at them, is to allow or bring in an alien people to conquer them. And so Jerusalem falls to the Assyrians, Nebuchadnezzar, and people of that sort. Gildas is a prophet for the Britons, as Jeremiah was a prophet for the Israelites. And he is reacting to the loss of Jerusalem, the failure to hold Jerusalem, i.e. Britain, against this outside people. But the way to resist them is not by taking arms. It is to mend your fences with God. If you do that, God will renew his protection and he will sweep away the Saxons. You don't have to do it yourself. God will do it for you, provided you earn that much credit. And there's a direct line from Gildas to the history of the Britons. The history of the Britons is not saying wait for God to do it, because they're getting a bit bored with that. But they are saying still the basic same thing, that Britain is the rightful property of the Britons. And the way that they're telling history is to that purpose, that they will eventually recover Britain when God sees fit to allow it.
What I think is interesting is actually that ties directly back to what we were saying about the 20th century historians writing for the time they were writing through the paradigm of the world that they could see. And that really fits with the history of the Britons in the 9th century, in that, like you say, they are looking at a world in which the Britons, the Welsh, as the Saxons called them, are confined to the western half of or at least their kings are confined to the western half of the island. and Gildas, although he definitely wasn't writing history, is also writing for his time. And I think that's something that it's easily forgotten, isn't it, when we are looking at the text, in that these people are not writing for 2021. They're not writing for a modern audience.
Right.
And I suppose we kind of need to try and appreciate the fact that they're obviously writing for a contemporary audience, for a temporary purpose, which might be totally different to what we're trying to read into their texts.
Well, I think in order to read the text, you've actually got to work out the context in which the author is writing and what their purpose is. Otherwise, you shouldn't be reading it.
Absolutely. So we have, quote unquote, Nennius in the 9th century, trying to write a kind of optimistic story of why the Britons, in fact, are the great people, both against the Romans and the Saxons. And he, like you say, he tries to flesh out Gildas, which is incidentally what Bede tries to do as well, to a certain extent, is flesh out the little clues that are in Gildas. And he creates this narrative of what that war that he tells us that Gildas says did happen when Aurelianus, was a resistance leader, and etc., etc. That ends with Baden Hill, which frustratingly is the year of Gildas's birth, which we don't know.
That's right. That's right.
So then the legend kind of develops further, I presume, because the history of Britons is taken up by later writers, such as famously Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yes.
Who do even more with this story.
Yes, very much so. And it has been taken up in Wales between the two. In the Celtic community, if you like. It's become part of the Welsh legend. You have earlier references to Guinevere and so on. So it's being fleshed out. But I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth comes in at a point which is following the Norman conquest. I mean, the point about the dominant history of Britain in the 11th century is that it is an English history. It is built around Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And both of those are English focused. Everything else is marginal. They are God's people and they are in the right. After 1066, that no longer serves the purposes of the insular elite, who are now Norman. So what Geoffrey of Monmouth does is effectively take away from the English their centrality and their goodness and their divine support. The book he writes, the work he produces, has the Britons as the goodies and the Christians, and the Saxons as the baddies and pagans. So you've got the role reversal. And of course, Geoffrey took up the figure of Arthur into this and converted what was a bundle of probably generally rather short royal genealogies from Wales and the north. He converted them into one huge genealogy of the kings of Britain. And you have to remember that in his work, The Histories of the Kings of Britain, Arthur, although he's by far the biggest figure, and he fills up, about a ninth? I've forgotten the exact amount, but anyway, he fills up is the center of the work. But in fact, he is king number, I don't know, 35 or something. There are a huge number of them, I've forgotten. But it connects it, if you like, to a biblical style of history, where you've got generation after generation after generation of the descent of God's people. And this concept of the Britons being God's people inside Britain is coming through again from the Welsh sources. Geoffrey's quite into Breton and Welsh sources, and he creates an archbishopric, for example, in southeast Wales, which it's just not there. You can't have it, but it's there for him.
So he's also writing in his own context, isn't he? He's got his purpose. Why do you think then that in not just Geoffrey, but also later medieval writers, they take up with, real enthusiasm the Arthur kind of legend and embellish it each in their own way? Why do you think it so endures, over quite a long period of time, really, isn't it? To be talking about a 5th century king. It's quite strange that people almost 1,000 years later would still be writing about and interested in that.
Well, they're not interested in the 5th century. What they're interested in is a court which is at sufficient distance to be able to embellish, develop, discuss a variety of different issues without it having any immediate political risk attached. I mean, the great problem, if you talk about things closer to your own life, is that you can tread on toes. So it's quite helpful to shift your discussion of the nature of warfare or chivalry, or how the Christian warrior class should behave, which are all very powerful themes in the Arthurian story. If you can shift them into a very remote space, you can embellish them, you can develop them as you see fit, without losing any of the power of the ideas, because they are very entertaining, and you can use that as a way of influencing people. I mean, it's quite a powerful message. It's quite a powerful vehicle by which to engage, and this is what is being done. I mean, a lot of the material by the 13th century, most of the material is in French, written on the continent. So it's not just distant chronologically from the time when Arthur is supposed to have been, but it's also distant geographically. And you find that Arthurian legend is developed thereafter in Italy, in Iceland, in Spain. It goes all over. And this connects with this sense of an international warrior class and clerisy across Western Europe, which really sort of coheres around the idea of crusading, and even extends to places like Constantinople and Palestine, following the First Crusade, with the success of the very unlikely success of the Frankish army, and the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It takes Arthur with it. So he's a universal figure, if you like. And the further removed he is from the dynasty ruling your own particular corner of Western Europe, the safer it is to get involved with it.
So Arthur is kind of convenient almost for two reasons, because he is remote in terms of time and geography, so you can say whatever you like without it being, like you say, stepping on anyone's toes. And also it's got all the themes, the Arthurian legend, like you say, that appeals to that the warrior and the ruling classes of the Latin world in the medieval era. It's kind of got universal appeal because of the themes that it talks about.
Yes.
And then, of course, because eventually, because so much is written, you get to the idea of historians thinking, well, there's no smoke without fire.
No smoke without fire. Yes, yes, yes.
Is that more or less the bridge that takes you to then the 19th century historians, or is there anything else that happens in between?
Well, on the whole, the 19th century historians had decided there was very little smoke and virtually no fire. What they were saying is that this has been blown out of all proportion. And if there was an Arthur, he's a local prince with only a local impact. And there was a sort of bit of consensus around placing him in southeast Wales. But there's always been a certain preference for North Britain as well. And that has, I think, strengthened in recent years. Those who want to actually write about Arthur are more inclined to put him in North Britain at the moment than they are in the West. But there are people in both categories. And that's mostly because of the names of the battle, which are easier to identify up north than they are in England or Wales, apart from Baden.
Talking of kind of modern thinking, modern ideas, or modern, maybe we should say theories. Well, I don't know exactly when it emerged. It feels like it was quite au fait in maybe like the 90s, early 2000s. I'm not sure. That might be totally wrong. But there became this idea of Arthur as a late Roman officer, as a kind of military commander. Perhaps linked to somewhere like Sarmatia, an auxiliary kind of commander who'd been posted to Britain. Where did that come from, and why? I'm guessing, why shouldn't we subscribe to that view is going to be your idea, Nick.
Well, he could be a Martian. The starting point for those ideas is an American scholar called Kemp Malone, who wrote in 1924 a short article which flagged up the fact that there is somebody called Artorius, he's called Lucius Artorius Castus, regarding whom two inscriptions have survived on the coast of Dalmatia. What was Yugoslavia is now Croatia. And this Artorius was a successful army careerist, probably in the 2nd century, if not in the early 3rd. But interestingly, he served in Britain. He served as the 3rd in command of the Legion at York. And then he led a force which included Britons, as far as one can judge. Of course, there are problems with reading the inscription, against somewhere which began ARM. And the suggestion was that, therefore, that this was from Britain to Armorica, which is the old name of basically of Brittany, where, of course, in the late Roman period, there were various unrest and rebellion, which needed to be put down. And so, Lucius Artorius Castus. I mean, the great advantage is that the guy is called Artorius. It's his family name. Artorius is a Roman aristocratic name. It's not a very well-known one. The obvious reason for that is that there was never an emperor called Artorius. That particular family never produced an emperor. When you have an emperor, loads of people then claim the name because they are freedmen or they have obtained citizenship under that emperor, and they naturally take the name. Because he was never an emperor, there are very few Artorii, but he is one of them. Then you need to combine with that, which is entirely factual, but has got nothing to do with King Arthur. You've got to combine with that the ideas that were developed by a man called Scott Littleton, who is another American, an anthropologist, who flagged up the fact that there is a certain similarity between one or two of the stories that we have from the medieval period about Arthur and elements in what is called the Nart legend. Now, the Nart legend is a group of oral stories. It's a tradition that has survived in the Carpathian Mountains in a language which is descended from Old Iranian. Old Iranian is the language of the Sarmatians and Alans. Now, the Sarmatians and eventually the Alans were neighbors of the Roman Empire already by the 3rd century, in fact, the 2nd century, and they were on the opposite side of the Danube, around Hungary. And when the Huns and Goths pushed through into the Roman Empire, some of them at least fled before the Huns and ended up in Western Europe, in areas like Gaul. But even before that, there were Sarmatian units employed in the Roman army. And it is said by one Roman historian that a significant number was sent by Marcus Aurelius to Britain. This is a force that had been negotiated in a treaty settlement which ended a war in the late 2nd century, and that a large number of these, several thousand people, were sent to Britain. Now, the idea that Scott Littleton had was that they brought with them their stories, their traditional stories, and it was then Celticized, and the stories went from the Sarmatians into the Welsh. Now, there are one or two little problems with that. One is that the number of stories that really connect is extremely small. And the critical one really is the story of the disposal of the sword. Now, I'm sure you're familiar, everybody is familiar with the story of disposing of Arthur's sword when, in the 15th century version, it's Bedivere, I think. When Arthur's mortally wounded, he says to Bedivere, "Take my sword and throw it in the lake." And Bedivere says, "Oh, nice sword," and doesn't. Goes back and says, "Oh, yes, I threw it in." Yes, nothing happened. So he says, "Do it again." And then he says, "Do it again a 3rd time." And the hand comes out the lake, grabs the sword, and waves it menacingly several times at poor old Bedivere, who was just trying to recycle it. That story is virtually the same. It's not identical, but it's so similar that you can say, okay, it's basically the same story as a story of the disposal of the sword of a Nart hero called Batraz. Again, you've got water, you've got the sword, you've got the failure to do it, and then eventually it's done and everything can move on. So what Scott Littleton was saying, look, the sword story comes from the Black Sea region and it arrives in Wales. Here is how it arrives in Britain. We've got Sarmatians in the Roman army, and therefore Arthur is a Nart hero. He's a Sarmatian story. Well, yes and no. The name is Latin, almost certainly. Latin names do go into Welsh, and quite a lot of them. Patrick, for example. There are no Sarmatian names in Welsh. And the problem with the story of Batraz and his sword is that it is a very late story. We can't date it firmly any earlier than the 19th century. The problem, of course, being it's an oral tradition. And there are various versions, and it's the last version, the latest version, that has things like gunpowder in it, that has the one that looks like Arthur and his sword. So you've got these two possibilities. Does the story go from the Black Sea to Wales in a past which is so distant and then survives intact in both areas to reappear in Wales, well, in the West, in the story of the disposal of Excalibur, and around the Black Sea, it doesn't actually emerge as an oral story that we know of until the 1800 or something. Alternatively, does it go the other way? Because the Crusaders were out there, they actually took Constantinople for a couple of generations. So they dominated the Black Sea, at least the southern end of the Black Sea, around the 13th century. The story was already formed by the time that occurred in the West. Does the story go into the Narts saga? I don't know, but I think it's a pretty far-fetched to think that we can definitely show that even that story, which is the one that's got greatest similarity, necessarily derives from the Sarmatians and enters the Celtic community. And the other great problem with the Sarmatians is that archaeologically, you can only ever find 500 of them in Britain. So despite the fact that you've got a Roman author actually saying, well, there's 5,000 of them sent to Britain, the only unit in Britain that we know about archaeologically that was definitely Sarmatian is the garrison of the fort at Ribchester in Lancaster. Does that make Arthur the governor, the commander of the garrison at Ribchester? No, it doesn't. It really is stretching things. And even at Ribchester, the amount of Sarmatian material it's virtually not there. It's tiny. So the Sarmatians don't appear to bring much material culture. They probably didn't bring any women folk. They would have become Romans relatively quickly. And certainly in the next generation, their myths, their stories, their legends would have been forgotten as they fitted in Britain. So on the whole, I think on several fronts, the idea that any of the Arthurian legend comes from the Black Sea is fairly far-fetched.
Yeah, and it does seem far more likely that the Arthurian legend that we know was popularized throughout the medieval Latin world is more likely to have influenced stories in the Black Sea region rather than a story in the Black Sea region migrating to Britain thanks to one Sarmatian unit and then coming so firmly entrenched in this British legend. That certainly on the balance of probability seems unlikely. I think throughout we've kind of really what's been revealing is the extent to which whatever source or story or legend, it's really got to be put into its own time, and it actually has very little to say. I think one of the striking things about so many of the Arthur stories, legends, sources is how little they have to say about, say, 5th century Britain, and how little they relate to what we do know about 5th century Britain. The only thing that really does link, the only thread you can kind of pull, and the end of it is in the 5th century, is of course Baden Hill.
Yes.
Again, it's kind of similar question to the very start. What, if anything, can we say about the Battle of Baden Hill, the Siege of Baden, or however it's phrased?
Well, Gildas is the only near contemporary authority for Baden, and he referred to the Siege of Baden Hill. He did so in a particular context. He did so as a way of telling his audience the date when the historical story changed from a time when God was weighing up the quality of his people, when the war was still going on and they were winning some and losing some. That all ended in the year of Baden. And he used 3 ways of dating it. It's a date which really matters to Gildas. He dated it by reference to his own birth, but of course not everybody would have known the year in which he was born. He dated it in reference to the present. It was 43 years and a month before the present. And they must have known when the present was, even though we don't. And it was the year of the siege of Mount Baden. So he nailed down the year he was referring to. Now, what actually happened in that year that was important to Gildas was the shift from that period of warfare and a period when the Britons were successful sometimes and the Saxons were successful sometimes, to the next period, which is the present. Gildas starts the present from his own birth. My generation sort of feel to it. And what is the defining characteristic of the present, in his eyes, is the utter immorality of his people. The Britons are wicked and evil. Well, if you translate that through Gildas's logic, it should tell you who won the war. Now, the danger that everybody falls into is saying, oh, well, Mount Badon, the final battle in which God gave victory to the Britons. But that isn't actually what Gildas says. He doesn't describe it as a great victory. It's a siege. You can win a siege by simply not being overrun. And on the whole, the likelihood is the Britons were being besieged and not the other way round, because that's how it usually went in that period. If it's actually the Saxons who won the war, that fits a great deal better with a lamentation and an urging of his own contemporaries to mend their ways, which is what the work is about. We get easily sidetracked because there is that part of the De Scidia, the ruin of Britain, which reads as if it's a very bad history. And we think, oh, well, you know, he's not very good at doing this, but this is a history. It's not a history. It's Gildas saying to his audience, this is how the relationship between God and his people, his British people, works. This is what you expect the outcomes to be. Do good and you do well, do bad and God will punish you. What he's actually saying is that the Britons are being punished in the present because they are immoral in the present. My point is, therefore, that they didn't win the war. Badon is only referred to because it marks the year, not because it marks victory. They are two fundamentally different things.
Now that I might be totally wrong here, but I believe that's quite a different view to what many people who've read Gildas and studied it would say.
Yeah, it is.
So I don't want to misrepresent you here, but would you therefore say Gildas is talking, he's very much, he's not writing history, he's writing a polemic. He's writing, very much a kind of religiously driven condemnation of his time, what he calls, you say, the present. And
he's urging reform.
Yeah.
He's urging reform.
And you would say that's because the Britons, have done very badly.
Yeah.
And that he explains that, of course, as he would, through religious reasons, through their, and therefore the only significance of Badon is just that it is marking his start point of the decline rather than the start point of a kind of golden age of peace.
Yes, it's marking the end of that period of warfare and the beginning of the terrible state of affairs today. Now, you can say, okay, well, other people don't read it like that, but and you're right, they don't. People have somehow or other read Gildas, read Badon as a great victory. The history of the Britons does. And that has encouraged people to do so. If you go back to the archaeology, it fits remarkably well with my suggested reinterpretation. The amount of archaeological evidence of Saxons is relatively limited for most of the 5th century. On the whole, you've got this sense of a Roman Britain that sort of limps on, certainly to the mid-5th century. And then places like South Cadbury only get refortified in somewhere around 480-ish. The last quarter of the 5th century. And the spread of Anglo-Saxon material culture really only kicks off in that same period, the last quarter of the 5th century. So if you want to look for an extended moment, if you like, when England begins, there's a sort of very early, relatively localized East Coast and a little bit here and there around 430. But the real process, the first stage of the expansion is between about 470 and 500. Now, if you accept the traditional dating of Gildas, that he's writing about 540 odd, going back to his birth and the Battle of Baden, you place it somewhere around the 490s, early 500, something like that. Those things all fit together. One of the great problems of saying, well, you know, the Britons won the war and the Battle of Baden was the concluding final victory of that war, whether fought by Arthur or anybody else, it doesn't really matter, is that it cuts across the archaeological evidence. If there's this British success and they're regaining much of the province, the old diocese of Roman Britain, the archaeology should look different. It doesn't fit that picture.
And of course, the world that Gildas talks about is very Western. The tyrants that he names, the kings of Britain, are all pretty confidently placed in Wales or the West Country, are they not?
Well, the only ones we can confidently place are in Wales and the West Country. Yes, we can confidently place one in Cornwall and Devon. We can confidently place one in North Wales and one in South West Wales. The other two are a bit floaty, but yes, that's right. The only kings he actually deals with, and he deals with them, urging them to reform, are certainly very Western. There are these references in the text to figures that sound like governors and British soldiers. He doesn't place those anywhere, but you can't ignore them. It's as if there is some sort of skeleton of Roman Britain still in being, but there is also a domination by Saxons that is having an effect of one sort or another at the time. And he actually says, you can't visit the shrines of the martyrs now. One of which is at Verulamium, St Alban. The other of which we're not entirely sure where it is, but it's probably South East Wales, Caerleon. Because you can't visit because the roads aren't free. You can't travel about, and that is presumably because of the Saxons. Well, if you've got Saxons stopping somebody who is probably in the southwest somewhere, getting to Caerleon, you've got Saxons spread a long way over the south of Britain.
Which therefore suggests that the present Gildas is talking about is not the kind of the period after a glorious victory, but rather, as you say, after a defeat.
And if you go back to Jeremiah, who is his favorite Old Testament prophet, and the fall of Jerusalem, you don't talk about the fall of Jerusalem when you've just won the war.
Indeed. Well, it's been a really fascinating exploration, Nick, of the history of a legend, really. And also, I think a really interesting interpretation of the 5th century and Gildas, which, you know, it feels like there's not one, there is no other source that there's so much ink spilt and different views about, because ultimately everyone who wants to know anything about the 5th and 6th century has to use Gildas, and it's just an infuriating source in many ways.
Well, it is infuriating and it isn't. The trouble with Gildas is that people read the wrong bit. The bit that you need to read is the tedious stuff. It's the stuff that says that you're all bad and urging you to do better, which isn't easy reading for the modern audience who prefer to read the history. But the history is subordinate. What he's writing is this attempt to persuade his contemporaries to mend their fences with God. And when you get hold of that, when you realize that that's what the work is about, it makes a great deal more sense of the time in which he's living.
And that, I guess, wraps up nicely our theme throughout, which has been about people writing for the time they're living in, whether they're in the 70s, 19th century, 9th century, whenever it is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for giving us so much of your time today.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Peter.
Thank you so much to Nick for coming on the show. There will be a link to his latest book, King Arthur, The Making of the Legend, down in the description below. Make sure that you check that out. I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex, and thanks for listening to History's Most.